Just real briefly, this past Tuesday I got a call about noon from a wonderful friend. Many of you have been praying for our friend Maurice. Maurice asked me if I would come to the hospital and conduct a wedding ceremony for him and his now bride, Brianna. Never done that before, but when a friend asks you to do something, you do it. And so that's what I did. We experienced the most pure expression of love that I know Gayla and I have ever seen. It was absolutely beautiful. Then on Thursday, Maurice asked me to conduct his funeral. He had been in the hospital battling cancer. He's 25 years old, and it just makes no sense at all. Well, I'd never done a wedding, I've never been asked by a friend to conduct a funeral, much less all in the same week. Maurice went on ahead of us yesterday about 3:15. On Thursday, actually before that, Maurice had said, when I beat this, I'd like to come to your church and kind of tell them some things. I said, I think that'd be great. Talked to Joe. Joe said that'd be awesome. Thursday, Maurice said, remember what we talked about? Well, I'm not going to make it, so I want you to talk to him for me. I'm going to tell you what Maurice told me to tell you. He said, love people. Look past their shell. Get to know people. Make God your best friend. Love people unconditionally. Work hard. Keep the main things the main thing. And I want you to tell those people that helped me at our fundraiser how much I love them, how much I appreciate them. Then he said these words. He quoted he quoted some words from a slave preacher whose words were quoted again by Dr. Martin Luther King in 1963. He said, I've never always been a good guy. He said, I'm not what I ought to be. I'm not yet what I'm going to be. But thank God I'm not what I used to be. And he wanted me to tell you that. He also wanted me to tell you that his favorite Bible character was David. He said, my favorite Bible character is David. I want to tell you why. He's a little dude like me, but he made a big difference. Those are the words from Maurice Talley to you. Thank you.
The text we will be using when we get to it, which will be a few minutes, is in Philippians chapter 4, if you choose to go there. Philippians chapter 4. When you think about the subject of grace, and based on what we have heard in the announcements, what we've prayed about already, what John just talked about, you might be thinking, grace? How in the world would that apply to all the hurt and pain that so many people in this church and so many people that we love have gone through, not just recently, but in the last couple of years? Well, I think grace applies to it directly. You see, when you look at how grace is applied, when God gives grace, God says, I don't owe you anything. It is a gift freely given. Sometimes you hear people make the ridiculous statement, I just want what I deserve. The reason I say that's ridiculous because if most of us looked at our lives very carefully, we would say, oh Lord, please do not give me what I deserve. Because I have had my good days. I have had my days where I have been really wonderful, full of love and kindness and gentleness. But I've had many days when it's been just the opposite. And when it comes right down to it, not much of us deserve anything good, although we typically think we do. Grace is saying it's a free gift. There is nothing that you can do to earn it. There is nothing that you can do to make me owe you grace. It is a gift freely given. Now, if you take that concept, it's a gift of God where God doesn't owe anyone anything. It is not a contractual obligation. When I was a younger man, I used to teach it that way because that's the way it had been taught to me. I actually taught that grace was a contractual obligation. God said, if you do this, then I'll give you grace. Therefore, it's a contract, because if I do this, then God owes me grace. But that nullifies the entire concept of grace. It's not the way it works. There are certain things that God tells me to do. To love people, for example, as John just quoted. And yes, I do those things, but God, to make sure it's always of grace and never something I have earned, not something that he owes me, always gives the blessing before you do the act. Now, if I had time, I could show you that from the 4th and 5th chapter of Romans, actually 3rd and 4th chapter of Romans, forgive me. And maybe in the next week or two I will. But I could show you that God does not wait to see what you do before he gives you the blessing. God gives the blessing first. There are different kinds of grace. Different kinds. Maybe that's the wrong way to say it. Different categories, maybe, is a better way to say it. One is a thing called, we would call common grace. What I mean by that is that God gives it to the world. Jesus would say it this way: it rains on the just and the unjust. If God decides to bless the planet with rain, it not only blesses the people who are of God, it blesses all the people, no matter what. The good guys, the bad guys, and the guys in between. It's a general gift that God gives to humanity, to humankind. Then there's a special kind of grace that God gives just to the believers. And obviously, the most important of those would be the gift of salvation, that God says, in spite of what you have done, I will make you as if you have never done anything wrong at all. I will make you righteous. I will make you holy. And because we are righteous and holy, then God says, then you'll come to be in my heaven because you have no sin on you. And when you die, that's where you will be. You will be with me. And that's not to the whole world. That's to the people who are God's people, people who have yielded themselves to him. But even within that, there are different kinds of grace, different categories, I guess I should say, because since it's a gift freely given, God doesn't know everybody the same thing. Now, he does offer salvation to all those that become his people. But within that, you have seen, as well as I, that there are some people it seems as if everything in their life seems to go well. I mean, if they start a business, it makes a ton of money. All people around them seem to be getting the flu. They don't. It just looks like everything goes their way. And I think sometimes we look around and go, wait a minute. I go to church more than he does. I probably give more than he does. I know I'm prettier than he is. Why is it? Why is it that God seems to bless him or her with all these wonderful gifts, and yet I don't have all those gifts? I deserve for God to give it to me too, don't I? Well, if it's of grace, then nobody deserves it. What does that mean? It means that God sometimes chooses to bless this person in that way and that person in that way. Sometimes he chooses to allow that person to go through that suffering. Sometimes he delivers that person from that suffering. I can't explain how God chooses, for I am not God. I don't understand God on many occasions, but that's really a good thing, because if I could understand God, he wouldn't be much of a God. Now, if you're saying, well, wait a minute, not every blessing comes from God. I agree that there's some evil people that do things that turn out quite well for them. But when we think about it from the Christian viewpoint, it says every good gift comes from the Father. Therefore, if I do happen to be in a business that I start and it makes a lot of money, thank you, God, because every good gift comes from God to us. And why does that other person start that? We had a fellow in our workshop for Marriages in Crisis. By the way, next weekend you'll see the tables sitting out here. We'll be here with Marriages in Crisis on Friday and Saturday, and they'll start back Sunday at noon. We'll have tables set up out here that we'll leave for Sunday. It's just too difficult to take them down and put them up. By the way, feel free to sit at those tables. It's a great place to bring your donuts. Put your donuts right up here. Eat. Just don't mess up our tablecloths. But you can come and eat on our tables here. We'd love to have you sit at our tables. That's wonderful. We had a fellow that came in our last workshop. He, a good Christian man who was a construction guy, he built houses for a living, lived in a small town in a very minimally populated state. Obviously, I'm trying to keep confidentiality here. But he lived in a state that didn't have a lot of people, and therefore, even though he lived in a large city in that state, it didn't have a lot of people. As a matter of fact, probably within 5 miles of here, there are more people than in the capital city of that state. He decided that after prayer, supplication, that God had given him the idea and the wisdom to build a subdivision. Maybe that works in Brentwood. Maybe it works in Belmead. It doesn't work in a city of about 100,000 people to be able to run your subdivision when you just need those houses. He wound up losing all of that, but he was going to be okay. He was going to be okay until his younger brother decided to sue him, which forced him into bankruptcy. He got into his own trouble. It was a decision he made. He felt God was in it, but it was his decision. We look at that and go, Galatians chapter 6, 7, and 8. Be not deceived. God is not mocked. For whatsoever man soweth, that shall he also reap. That's the King James Version. That's got to be right. So you say, okay, what are you trying to say? It could have happened where that the next guy did the very same thing in that little town, and for some quirk, at least it would appear to be a quirk for us, he winds up making a fortune. Well, who thanks God? Which of them should thank God? You see, if it's like, God, you owe me, we're all in trouble. But since it's a free gift, then God can choose. It's a free gift. He can choose who to give health to and who he allows to get sick. He can choose whom he miraculously heals. He can choose who he heals through physicians. He can choose who he lets go through the process and die. It's his choice. And because it's a free gift, grace, it is God's choice. You say, wow, you're painting a picture of God I don't know that I like. I'll admit right now, there's several things about God that just tick me off on occasion. Anybody else feel that way? You say, you're standing in a pulpit. We're pretty close. The lightning could get us all. I think God appreciates honesty. There are things I read in my Bible. There are things that I see happen, and I think I don't get it. I don't understand it. I'm not real happy about it. God can handle it. He's okay that I don't get it, that I don't comprehend it. But in all of that context, we're in Philippians chapter 4, verse 4. John called me last Sunday afternoon and suggested I speak on this. Here's what it talks about. Rejoice in the Lord always. I'll say it again, rejoice. Now, as soon as he says that, rejoice in the Lord always, I just give you two scenarios. Here's the guy who built the subdivision and went bankrupt, particularly after his your brother sued him. Here's a guy that builds a subdivision and makes a gazillion bucks. Is that a real number? That's not a real number, is it? Okay, a gazillion bucks. He says both of you should rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. Gentleness, not anger, not frustration. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Now, I will admit that in the New Testament, the way they understood that was they thought the end was coming pretty soon, that Jesus would arrive in the clouds with the trump of the archangel, and that everything was about to be over. And when they would read that, they would say, the Lord is near, meaning it's about done anyway, we're all right. To us, we would read that and go, that still is possible. He may be here tomorrow. He may be here this afternoon. I don't know. But the way I would more look at it today would be, he hasn't abandoned us. The next verse says, do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. I was a young man. I was a freshman in college, an 18-year-old theologian, the most dangerous kind. When a friend of mine, Donnie Hilliard, who, by the way, now has Parkinson's disease, we just buried another one of my friends who died of Parkinson's disease just a few days ago. But we were young. I was a freshman in college. I had had a whole year of Bible. He was still a senior in high school, therefore he was a heathen that knew nothing. We sit in front of his house on Lively Street in Augusta, Georgia, and he told me he was worried, and I quoted this passage to him. I quoted from the King James. I can't remember it now, but do not worry, do not be anxious about anything, but in everything. And I quoted that to him, and he looked at me and he said, if the Lord's going to tell me not to worry, then he better tell me how. I thought that was pretty perceptive for a high school senior. It's perceptive for anybody. I don't care who they are. Look at that. So he does. He actually goes on to tell us how. The first thing he says, in everything by prayer and petition. Everything? Anybody stay up late last night to watch the Texas A&M Ole Miss game? Am I the only one who watched that to the bitter end? It's fun. It's fun to watch Johnny Manziel play when he's not playing us. It's just fun to watch him. The game was won on the very, very last play. The clock expired on the winning play. Now, I'm not going to spoil it for you and let you know who won, but the Kleins are happy. They should give you a clue. What fascinated me was just before the last play, they showed Johnny Manziel on the sideline on his knee with his team, many of his team, I'm assuming probably the offensive line, and they were on their knees. They're watching the game when all of a sudden Manziel grabs the hand of the guy next to him, and they all grab hands, and Manziel starts praying. First thing I thought was, I wonder if he's a Christian. It was the first thing that went through my mind. You say, why would you doubt it? Well, he's Johnny Manziel. He is a tremendous football player, but off the field has somewhat of a reputation of being not the nicest guy to be around, if you listen to all those reports. So that was the first thought. I wonder if he's a Christian. Second thought was, with his bad boy reputation, I wonder if he's really praying or if that's mockery. Forgive me, but that's went through my mind. Then I thought, I wonder if he's praying to the same God we do. I mean, for all I know, he's a Buddhist or a part of Confucian. Confucian? I just made up a whole word there, didn't I? Let's just not try to pronounce that one again. For all I know, but then I'm thinking, wait a minute, he's on a Texas team playing in a Mississippi stadium. They're pretty well going to be praying to the same God I am, probably, don't you think? And then I'm thinking, how dare anybody ask God to let you win a football game? Why would God care? Gene Stallings, who is a great Christian man, by the way, a former coach at the University of Alabama, among other things, just after he won the national championship at Alabama in '92, quarterback Jay Barker, was asked by a magazine, I read the quote, they said, do you ever pray to win a football game? He said, I think God has a lot more to worry about than who wins a football game. He said, I pray that nobody gets hurt. And so I was thinking that when I'm watching this guy pray, because I'm assuming he's praying to win the game. Then it hit me, that's an assumption. There was a Mississippi player that was hurt just a few minutes before. For all I know, he's praying for that guy to be all right. I don't know what he's praying for. I went through all those judgments in a matter of seconds. I couldn't take very long because the next play won the game. So I got distracted again. Do you understand the prejudice I just gave you? Why would anybody pray about a football game? How dare you insult God when there's so many important things going on in the world? We have prayed for people here to be healed. John told us about a man we prayed for to be healed that has already gone on. We have had lots of death and etc. And when I compare that to who wins a football game, if that's what he was praying for, it just kind of irks me. Not about Johnny Manziel, but about anybody. Why would you do that? But then I look at this passage. But in everything, by prayer and petition. Now, God may choose not to answer the prayer. Or he might choose to answer the prayers of the people from Mississippi. Maybe God has no concern whatsoever with who wins that game. Maybe it's just irrelevant to God. So he looks and goes, I hear you. Well, let's see if the guy makes the field goal. Or maybe there's something in the ultimate scheme of God where that winning that game is going to make something happen. It's going to make something happen. It's going to make something happen. It's going to do something good for the world or for the kingdom. So maybe it does matter to God if somebody wins that game. You understand? I don't know. But it says in everything by prayer and petition. My daughter Joanna is here today with her husband Lee. When Joanna was very small, she had a cat. The cat was named Yoda because it was a great resemblance to Yoda from the Star Wars movie. I hated that cat. I mean, I don't hate all cats, but I did hate that cat. He was the kind of cat that liked to get up very high. So like at 2 o'clock in the morning, if I went to the refrigerator to get a cold drink of water, he would ambush me from the top of the refrigerator. Or she would actually jump on top of my head. I would scream and yell, and she would smirk and walk away. I ran over that cat twice. I didn't mean to, I just did. Oh, on one occasion I left the house and my cell phone rang, and Alice said, the cat's on top of your car screaming. The cat got on the top of the car, and I was driving away. They were thinking, he's really going to kill that cat. The first time I ran over the cat, or it could have been the second, but somewhere along the line when I ran over the cat, Joanna was very small. We're taking the cat to the vet, and she's crying, and I said, why don't you pray that God will heal your cat? Now, I have been in a lot of trouble for years over that because I told about it on tape. I was actually hunting pheasant in Nebraska a few years after that when a man said, I just went to an area-wide church meeting where they said they have Joe Beam on audio recorded, where he said he tried to raise a cat from the dead. I said, what did you say? He said, I knew you didn't try to raise a cat from the dead. Good bird dog, maybe, but not a cat. Just know you were going to do it. He said, what happened? And I told him the story. Does God care whether a cat lives or dies? I don't know. But is it okay for a 5-year-old to pray? God save the life of my cat. In everything by prayer and petition. Petition, that's another word that's kind of like intensified prayer. Prayer to the 10th power. Prayer on steroids. Whatever phrase makes that real for you. I'm not just tossing off a prayer, but I'm petitioning God. Catch this next thing. With thanksgiving. So, you mean the man who lost all of his money and went bankrupt because his brother sued him should thank God as he prays? That's what it says. And the man who made $1 gazillion, should you thank God? I would hope so. You mean we thank God either way? Well, yes. Why? Because we come to the realization that everything is a gift of God. That he owes me nothing. And when he chooses to give this blessing to that person, but not that blessing to me, in the great scheme of things, God probably has something in mind. Something I can't comprehend, something that's far beyond my understanding, because God can see the future. He did know whether that guy was going to make that field goal last night or not, if he cared. And so my thanksgiving is saying basically, I live by faith. And because you are so gracious and you give so many blessings, whatever gift you choose to give, thank you. Whatever gift you choose not to give, thank you. Whatever's going on, I will trust that you have not ignored me. Whatever's going on, I will trust that in your scheme of things, there's some reason for this. It may not be a blessing to me in the way I would think, as I have said here on many occasions before. It might be a blessing to the person I was praying for. It may be that even when that person dies that death that we look at and go, it really upsets me that he or she died. Why didn't you answer my prayer? I think if God were talking audibly to us today, sometimes his answer would be, well, because I love them too much to answer your selfish prayer. What do you mean? It is selfish that I'm praying that you let them live here. God's not upset with that. That's not a sinful selfishness. It's just, it's from my own, you understand? It's from me. But sometimes God's saying, but you see, because I can see the future, you don't know what she was facing a year from now, or 5 years from now, or 10 years from now. You don't know what was down the line for that person that would be so horrendous, and so I have allowed him or her to die because I know what's coming. And while you think that's the worst thing, because you cannot see from my perspective, you can't see that I'm saying, oh no. No, that was not the worst thing. Not at all. And while it hurts you, trust me and thank me. There was a guy named Paulie Dickerson that went to college with Alice and me. He preached for a little while. Paulie was one of these free spirits. Paulie might be one of these guys I haven't kept up with over the years that's had like 40 different jobs because he's just a free spirit. Like, I'll do this for a while, now I think I'll do something else. That would fit his pattern. But when he was a preacher for a while, he was telling me a story. He said, Joe, there was a couple that I knew, their child was dying. I was in the intensive care waiting room with them as we prayed intensively for God to please spare their baby's life. And then when the doctor came in and said the baby is gone, he said, I actually witnessed this. This couple got down on their knees and thanked God for answering their prayer. That'd be pretty hard to do, don't you think? How could you do that? By faith. God, I don't know what was down the line. I don't know what horrendous thing awaited. And if I really by faith believe that when a person leaves this planet, if he is one of your people or she is one of your people, that person goes to be with you, if I really believe that, I may be unhappy about the timing, I may be unhappy about the methodology, but we're all here by grace. It's your gift, freely given, and you don't choose to give it to every person just the same. But thank you. I trust you. So look at the next verse. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. That's where the peace comes from. The peace never comes from what happens. The peace always comes from how we interpret what happens. I hope that made some sense. Maybe I'll say it a different way. The peace doesn't come from what's occurring, because there are a lot of things in this world that just don't happen like I want them to. I get very upset about the way that people do things, and just life in general sometimes, like, that's just not fair. So where do you get this peace that passes understanding? It's when you have the faith to believe, I trust you. This hurts. Now he goes on to give a couple of other things I just don't have time for in addition to prayer. Very quickly, I'm just going to show you them. In verse 8 he says, whatever's true, whatever's noble. Basically what he's saying there is this, and let me see, I'll just paraphrase all that for time's sake. Here's what he's saying. Rather than having the mental images of the thing that you don't want to happen, by the way, that's what worry is. Worry is when you hold the mental images of what you don't want to happen. He says, think about the good things, the pure things, the right things, the holy things. Focus on those instead. And then in the next verse, he says, whatever you've learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put into practice. What he says there is get up and do something. Don't just sit there and stew. Put into practice what you have seen. Now, gentlemen, let's skip into the next chapter. In verse 10, he thanks these people that they've been good to him because of his needs. Same chapter. Chapter 4, verse 10. I greatly rejoice in the Lord that you've renewed your concern for me. Skip to the next verse. The next verse he says, I'm not saying this because I'm in need, for I have, catch this, learned to be content whatever the circumstances. Do what? I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. Verse 12. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I've learned the secret of being content in any and every situation. Whether well fed or hungry, whether we're living in plenty or in want, I can do everything through him who gives me strength. What's the secret of contentment? It's the same thing that gives you peace that passes understanding. Let's get back to chapter 3. I'll read a verse or two there for you. Beginning of verse 12 in chapter 3, he's talking about the goal of being with God. Not that I have already obtained all this or have been already made perfect. So he's not having all of this peace and contentment because he's perfect, or even that his faith is perfect. But I press on to take hold of that for which Christ Jesus took hold of me. Brothers, I do not consider myself yet to have taken hold of it, but this one thing I do, forgetting what is behind and straining toward what is ahead, I press on toward the goal to win the prize for which God has called me heavenward in Christ Jesus. All right, let's put that in context with Paul and wrap this up. I'm not thinking about the past anymore, he says. In context, if you think about it, he starts off talking about the good past. He just before that had said, I had the right credentials. I had the right connections. I was the rising star. Now I'm paraphrasing it, but that's what he said. Things were looking really good for me. I mean, I had it going on. Now we know the story, so we know that when he decided to convert from Judaism to Christianity, when he met Jesus and yielded himself to Jesus, that many of those people who had admired him, many of those people who said all these wonderful things about him, many of these people who would just sing his praises now despised him. As a matter of fact, some of them wanted him dead, and some of them even tried to kill him. So he looks back and he says, I'm not hanging on to what I could have been. I'm not hanging on to what could have been. Do you hear that? I'm not hanging on to what could have been. Oh, there's another side to his past that he wasn't hanging on to, how bad he was. You understand that even though he had done it in a good conscience at the time, he had actively persecuted Christians. As a matter of fact, he'd been present and helped with the stoning of Stephen, who was a good Christian man. He had actually helped participate in the murder, the assassination of a Christian just for being a Christian. So it's not like I'm not hanging on to what could have been. He's saying I'm not hanging on to what I was, just as John quoted a few minutes ago. I'm letting all it go. Why? As my friend Jeff King would say, it is what it is. How many of you can change your past? I mean, really. If they invented a time machine where you could go back and start at a certain age to fix all those things, you probably would fix most of those and make a whole nother mess. What do you think? He says, quit thinking about what could have been, quit thinking about what you were, and you look forward. So we buried my friend. I made a mistake of having to take my daughter Angel, our mentally handicapped daughter, down to Joanna's house as I was driving down to Huntsville. Alice was out of town. As I was driving down to Huntsville the night that he died, just to see his new widow, to give my condolences before driving back to Nashville that night to work the next day. And as I drove Angel, our daughter, to Joanna's house, I couldn't help it. I was so sad. I began to weep. It really upset her. She's been worried about it ever since. Not about me, but about death. Even the mentally handicapped can worry about dying. And so we've started these conversations. It's harder to explain it to her. Hopefully I can explain it to you. I didn't tell her, you will die. She will. Hopefully long after Alice and I are gone. But everybody's going to die. What do you do then? I love my memories of Larry. I will not let those go. But I will not think about what it could have been if they had found this earlier, if they had done that, or if that thing hadn't happened. Why would we want to look back and go, I actually had a friend ask me that the other day. We were leaving a very huge church over in Houston, where we were doing one of our marriage workshops over there. As we drove away, he's a good enough friend he can get away with this. His name is Jeff King. He's spoken here before. He said, have you ever thought that if you just kept your mouth shut on the politically correct issues where you were politically incorrect, that you'd still be a full-time preacher and at your age probably be preaching for a giant church like this? Have you ever wished that you could have had that and you could think about retirement and actually have money and all those kinds of things? Do you ever think about that? I say, yeah. I think everybody thinks about what could have been. Could I have done that? Could I have done that? Could I have done that? Yes, I do. But I let it go immediately for two reasons. One is I would have had no integrity, and I can't live with that. So forget it. The second is, it is what it is. The past is gone. I can enjoy my good memories of it, but I cannot bring it back. And rather than being mad at God because this person doesn't have a terrible disease and that friend died of it, that this person has a lot of money and we are at our age and have none, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, it's like, well, thank you. Thank you for all the blessings you've given, because in the scheme of things, we're all blessed beyond measure anyway. Are we not? Sometimes I think we're like the little kid that's got a gazillion toys who sees the commercial. I gotta have that. If you don't get me that, my life is over. If I can't have that, there's just no happiness at all. And we go to every store. We take out another loan. We buy that. And where is it 6 months later? Every parent in here is going, oh, I know what that's like. Sometimes I think God looks at us and we're going, I got to have that. I've got to have that. And he's going, you think you do. Trust me. Or, in the words of the great philosopher Mick Jagger, you don't always get what you want. But if you try sometime, you might just find you get what you need. Is there any better quote to end on?
My only hope is you, Jesus. My only hope is you.